Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily just for you. The road to Hollow Point wound through endless miles of forest, the trees on either side looming tall and tangled, their skeletal branches intertwining above like a tunnel. For the Bennetts, the move was supposed to be a fresh start. James and Emily Bennett had spent months looking for a home where they could escape the suffocating grind of city life. When the Turner house came up in their online search, a sprawling Victorian with a generous yard and a surprisingly low price, it felt like destiny. James drove the U-Haul with cautious enthusiasm, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as the road narrowed with each passing mile. Emily followed in their SUV with their 6-year-old daughter, Mia, staring out the window. Mia had been unusually quiet during the move, her wide blue eyes fixed on the dense woods outside. "It's going to be so fun, honey," Emily said, glancing back at her daughter. "You'll have your own big room to decorate and a yard to play in. Maybe even a tree house." Mia didn't answer. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something Emily couldn't hear. By the time they reached the house, the sun was low in the sky, casting Hollow Point in hues of orange and gray. The Turner house stood at the end of a gravel driveway, its pointed gables reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. The paint was chipped in places, and the wide porch sagged faintly under years of weather. Still, it had a charm, a melancholic beauty that seemed timeless. "Wow," James said as Emily pulled up behind him. He stepped out of the truck, shielding his eyes against the setting sun. "It's bigger than I thought." "It's gorgeous," Emily replied, though her voice wavered. Up close, the house felt different, imposing, almost alive. She shook the feeling off. "Come on, Mia, let's take a look." Mia climbed out of the car reluctantly, clutching her stuffed rabbit bun to her chest. She looked up at the house with an expression far too serious for a child. "It doesn't like us," she said softly. James chuckled, tousling her hair. "It's just an old house, sweetheart. You'll love it once we get settled in." Inside, the air was stale and thick, as though the house had been holding its breath. Dust motes danced in the fading sunlight filtering through cracked blinds. The floors groaned under their footsteps, and the walls seemed to absorb their voices, making the space feel larger and emptier than it was. The main staircase, a grand spiral of dark wood, led up to the second floor. To the left was a sitting room, its faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges. To the right, a dining room opened into a kitchen with an ancient, humming refrigerator. "Needs some work," James admitted, running his hand over the banister. "But it's got character." Emily forced a smile. "Lots of potential," she agreed. Mia didn't say anything. She stood at the base of the stairs, staring up at the darkened landing. Her grip on Bun tightened. "He's watching us," she whispered. Emily frowned, kneeling down to Mia's level. "Who's watching us, sweetie?" "The man with no face," Mia said matter-of-factly, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. James laughed nervously from the kitchen. "Kids and their imaginations, huh?" But Emily couldn't shake the chill that crept up her spine. As night fell, the family worked to settle in. James focused on unloading boxes while Emily made the beds. Mia wandered through the house, trailing her fingers along the walls. She didn't seem frightened, just watchful. "Don't go in the attic," she said suddenly at dinner. James and Emily exchanged a glance. "Why not?" James asked with a teasing grin. "That's where the treasure is." Mia didn't smile. "That's where he sleeps." When bedtime came, Emily tucked Mia into her new room, a cozy space with a window overlooking the backyard. She kissed her daughter's forehead and reassured her that everything would be fine. As Emily turned to leave, Mia grabbed her arm. "He's mad we're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Emily froze. "Who's mad, honey?" Mia pointed to the corner of the room. "Him." Emily turned, her heart pounding, but the corner was empty. Only the faint outline of the peeling wallpaper stared back at her. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart," Emily said, though her voice was unconvincing even to herself. She switched on the nightlight, a soft glow filling the room. "Good night, Mia. We'll see you in the morning." She closed the door and leaned against it, her breath catching. "It's just the stress of the move," she told herself. Kids get spooked in new places. But as she walked down the hallway to her own room, Emily could have sworn she heard soft, deliberate footsteps following her. The Turner house was unnervingly quiet as the Bennetts settled into their first night. With boxes still stacked in every corner and rooms half furnished, it didn't yet feel like home. The air was thick with the musty scent of neglect, and every creak of the floorboards seemed magnified in the silence. James tried to lighten the mood. After unpacking the essentials, he ordered pizza and gathered the family around the coffee table in the dimly lit living room. "Dinner's served," he announced, placing the pizza box down like it was a feast. Emily smiled, grateful for his effort. "Cheers to our new home," she said, raising her can of soda. Mia barely touched her slice. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes darting to the darkened corners of the room. Every so often she tilted her head, as if listening to something far away. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Emily asked, her voice soft. Mia didn't answer at first. Then in a quiet voice she said, "He doesn't like it when we laugh." Emily froze, the pizza slice halfway to her mouth. "Who doesn't like it, Mia?" Mia turned her gaze to her mother, her expression eerily serious. "The man with no face." James chuckled awkwardly. "That's enough scary stories for one night, kiddo. No more spooky talk, okay?" Mia said nothing, returning her attention to her untouched plate. The night stretched on, and exhaustion from the long day finally began to take over. After putting Mia to bed, James and Emily retreated to their own room. The master bedroom was spacious but bare, with only their bed and a single dresser set against the faded wallpaper. James climbed into bed with a groan. "I don't know about you, but I'm dead on my feet." Emily laughed softly, sliding under the covers. "You and me both. Tomorrow, we'll unpack the rest and start making this place feel normal." "Normal," James muttered, closing his eyes. "That's the dream." But Emily lay awake long after James's breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. The house creaked and sighed in the darkness, unfamiliar noises setting her nerves on edge. She told herself it was an old house settling into the cold night air. Nothing unusual, nothing sinister. And then she heard it, a hollow banging sound echoing from somewhere below. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Bang, bang, bang. Emily nudged James. "Did you hear that?" He groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. "It's an old house, Em. Pipes or something." "Pipes don't bang like that," she whispered, but James was already drifting back to sleep. Gathering her courage, Emily slid out of bed and grabbed her phone to use as a flashlight. She tiptoed down the hallway, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. The banging grew louder as she approached the staircase. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining her light into the yawning darkness below. The living room lay shrouded in shadow, the faint outline of their furniture barely visible. The banging had stopped. She waited, straining to hear anything, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. Just as she turned to go back to bed, she heard a soft creak behind her. Whirling around, she aimed her flashlight toward the hallway. Nothing, but the air felt heavier, colder. She quickened her pace back to the bedroom, closing the door behind her and locking it. Across the hall, Mia's room was still. She lay curled under her blanket, clutching Bun Bun to her chest. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, swirling faintly like smoke. Mia's lips trembled as she whispered, "Please go away." The air felt icy against her skin, and her nightlight flickered, casting her toys into warped, sinister shapes. A faint scraping sound came from the corner, like nails dragging against wood. She buried her face in Bun Bun's soft fur, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Mommy," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. But no one came. The next morning, Emily awoke to find Mia already sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. James was making coffee, blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. "Good morning, sweetie," Emily said, brushing Mia's hair from her face. "Did you sleep okay?" Mia shook her head slowly, her eyes hollow. "He stood by my bed all night." Emily knelt beside her, forcing a reassuring smile. "Mia, there's no one here but us. You were just dreaming, honey." Mia's gaze was unflinching. "He doesn't like you, Mommy." Emily's smile faltered. "Why would you say that?" "He told me," Mia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't like any of us." James walked in, oblivious to the exchange. "Who's ready for pancakes?" he asked cheerfully, setting plates on the table. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching them from the shadows of the house. The Bennetts spent the next day unpacking and trying to ignore the strange tension hanging over the house. James busied himself setting up furniture while Emily focused on organizing the kitchen. Mia wandered aimlessly through the house, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her hand, often stopping to stare at corners or closed doors as if waiting for something. "Why don't you draw me a picture of your new room, Mia?" Emily suggested, trying to engage her daughter. Mia only shrugged and shuffled off, her small footsteps muffled on the old rug. Emily sighed and turned her attention to a box of plates. The unsettling conversation from breakfast replayed in her mind. "He doesn't like you, Mommy." She told herself it was just a child's imagination. Kids were impressionable, especially in new environments, but the words had felt too specific, too deliberate. Down in the basement, James was busy arranging tools and storage boxes. The space was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its faint yellow glow barely pushing back the shadows. The basement was larger than he remembered, with rough stone walls and an uneven dirt floor that stretched into darkness at the far end. As he moved an old rotting cabinet to the side, something caught his eye, a door, partially hidden behind the debris. "Emily," he called up the stairs, "you've got to see this." A few moments later, Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, wiping her hands on a towel. "What is it?" James gestured toward the door. "There's a whole other room or something back here. It's not on the floor plans." Emily descended cautiously, eyeing the hidden door. It was made of thick, weathered wood and looked far older than the rest of the house. Rusted metal hinges held it in place, and deep claw-like scratches marred its surface. A padlock dangled from the latch, its chain corroded and fragile. "What do you think is in there?" James asked, his voice tinged with excitement. Emily frowned, unease prickling at her skin. "It's probably just an old storage room. Maybe it's better if we don't." But James was already pulling at the padlock, which snapped easily under his grip. He gave Emily a triumphant grin. Curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back, right? Emily didn't share his enthusiasm, but she stayed silent as he pushed the door open. The rusted hinges groaned like a wounded animal, and a wave of cold, stale air rolled out, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. Inside, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. "Stay here," James said, grabbing his phone to use as a flashlight. "I'll check it out." Emily's protest caught in her throat as he began his descent. The beam of his phone's light flickered over the dirt walls, revealing deep grooves carved into the surface, as though something had clawed at them desperately. The air grew colder the farther he went, and the smell intensified, sharp and coppery. At the bottom of the stairs, James found himself in a cramped tunnel that stretched far beyond the house's foundation. The walls were lined with old wooden supports, some of which had collapsed, leaving jagged shards of wood jutting out like teeth. The tunnel floor was damp, with puddles of stagnant water reflecting the faint light. A few steps ahead, the tunnel ended in another wooden door. This one was different, heavy, reinforced with iron bands, and adorned with strange symbols carved into its surface. The carvings were crude but intricate, spiraling into a central pattern that resembled an eye. James hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but curiosity propelled him forward. He reached out, running his fingers over the carvings. The wood felt unnaturally cold, almost wet. Then a soft whisper echoed through the tunnel. James, he froze, his blood turning to ice. Emily, is that you? No answer, only silence. Then the whisper came again, closer this time, and unmistakably female. James, help me. He spun around, the light from his phone sweeping the tunnel. There was no one there. Emily! He shouted, his voice cracking. He took a step toward the stairs, but stopped when the heavy door creaked, shifting slightly on its hinges, as if something on the other side had pressed against it. He didn't wait to find out. Turning on his heel, James bolted up the stairs, nearly slipping on the damp dirt as he scrambled back into the basement. Emily was waiting at the top, her face pale with worry. What happened? She asked as he slammed the hidden door shut, his chest heaving. Nothing, he lied, brushing past her. Just an empty tunnel, probably an old storm shelter or something. But Emily wasn't convinced. You're shaking. What did you see down there? Just nothing, Em. Let's forget about it. Before she could press him further, the basement light flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. A sharp, dragging sound came from the direction of the tunnel, like something heavy being pulled across dirt. Let's go upstairs, Emily whispered, grabbing his arm. That night, as the family tried to sleep, the house seemed more alive than ever. The walls groaned. Faint scratching noises echoed from the basement, and the oppressive air made it hard to breathe. Mia sat awake in her bed, her eyes fixed on the door. He's coming, she whispered to Bun Bun, her small hands clutching the stuffed rabbit so tightly the seams began to split. He's mad we opened the door. Emily couldn't shake the events of the previous day. James had been unusually quiet since his trip into the tunnel, and his deflections only deepened her unease. Mia, meanwhile, was growing more withdrawn, her cheerful demeanor eroding with every passing hour in the house. By late afternoon, Emily decided to get out of the house, if only for a little while. I'm going into town for groceries, she told James, who was tinkering with the living room's broken heater. Do you need anything? He didn't look up. No, I'm good. Be careful. Emily kissed Mia on the forehead. Be good for Daddy, sweetheart. I'll be back soon. Mia looked up at her with a somber expression. Don't talk to him, she said cryptically. Emily crouched down. Don't talk to who, honey? The man with no face, Mia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He's everywhere. Emily forced a smile and brushed her daughter's hair back. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Mommy will be back soon. The town of Hollow Point was a small cluster of shops and houses, most of which looked as old as the Turner house itself. The streets were eerily quiet, with only a few people walking briskly from one destination to the next. Emily parked her car outside a weathered general store with a hand-painted sign that read, Hollow Point Mercantile. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar. Emily grabbed a basket and began browsing the aisles. As she passed by a shelf of canned goods, she felt a pair of eyes on her. Turning, she saw an old man seated near the counter, his gnarled hands resting on a cane. He was staring at her intently, his milky blue eyes unblinking. New in town, he asked, his voice rough like gravel. Emily hesitated, clutching the basket tighter. Yes, we just moved into the Turner house. The man's expression darkened and he leaned forward. Turner house, you say? Yes, Emily replied cautiously. Why? The old man's face twisted into something between a grimace and a smirk. They should have burned that place down years ago. Emily's stomach tightened. Why do you say that? He glanced around the store, as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then lowered his voice. That house has a history, miss. The Turners were the last family to live there, and they didn't leave of their own accord. What happened to them? Emily asked, her heart pounding. The old man shook his head. No one knows for sure. Some say they vanished, others say they were killed. But everyone agrees on one thing. Something evil lives in that house, something that doesn't like to be disturbed. Emily's throat felt dry. Evil? Like what? He tapped his cane against the floor. The whispered order, he muttered, almost to himself. A cult. Used to operate in Hollow Point a long time ago. They were obsessed with summoning things. Some folks say they succeeded and the Turners paid the price. Before Emily could press him further, the store clerk interrupted. "Mr. Weller, leave the poor woman alone," she said, her tone sharp. Mr. Weller snorted, leaning back in his chair. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." Emily hurried through the rest of her shopping, her mind racing with questions. On her way out, she glanced back at the old man. He was still watching her, his pale eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name: pity, maybe, or fear. When Emily returned home, the atmosphere inside the house felt heavier than before. James was in the kitchen, unpacking a toolbox, but his movements were distracted and clumsy. "Mia's upstairs," he said without looking up. "She's been acting strange all day." Emily nodded, setting the groceries down. "James, I spoke to someone in town today. He said there's something wrong with this house." James sighed and rubbed his temples. "Not this again, Emily." "I'm serious," she said, her voice rising. "He mentioned a cult something about the whispered order, and the Turners didn't just move away. Something happened to them." James looked at her, his eyes shadowed. "Emily, I went down to that tunnel yesterday. I don't know what I saw, but it wasn't normal. We should have left as soon as we got here." "Then let's go," she pleaded. "We can stay in a motel for now, figure out what's next." James hesitated, then shook his head. "We can't just pack up and leave. The money's tied up in this place, and I'm not losing everything over some ghost stories." Emily opened her mouth to argue, but a loud crash upstairs cut her off. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the ceiling. "Mia," Emily whispered. They bolted up the stairs, following the sound to Mia's room. The door was ajar, and when they pushed it open, Emily gasped. Mia was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by drawings. They were scrawled on the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, a chaotic frenzy of black crayon lines. The images were crude but unmistakable, shadowy figures with featureless faces, standing in clusters around the house. In the center of the room, Mia had drawn a massive spiral, its jagged lines twisting inward to a dark, empty center. "Mia!" Emily cried, rushing to her. "What are you doing?" Mia turned slowly, her face pale and her eyes glassy. "He's coming," she said in a monotone voice. "He wants us to stay." Emily pulled Mia into her arms, but the little girl's body was stiff, unresponsive. James stared at the drawings, his face pale. "Emily," he said, pointing to the spiral. "That symbol, it's the same as the one on the door in the tunnel." Emily's stomach dropped. "James, we need to leave. Now." Before he could answer, a low, guttural sound echoed through the house. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, deep, resonant, and full of malice. Mia blinked, her voice breaking the silence. "It's too late." The guttural noise faded into an oppressive silence, leaving the Bennetts paralyzed with fear. Emily clutched Mia tightly, feeling the little girl's rapid heartbeat against her own chest. James stood frozen, his eyes darting to the dark hallway beyond Mia's room. Every shadow seemed alive, pulsating with unseen menace. "I'm getting the car keys," James said abruptly, his voice trembling. "We're leaving." Emily nodded quickly. "Mia, stay close to me." As James moved toward the stairs, Mia's small voice cut through the air like a blade. "It won't let us go." Emily knelt, looking into her daughter's vacant eyes. "What do you mean, sweetie? Who won't let us go?" Mia didn't respond. Her gaze drifted upward toward the ceiling. Following her eyes, Emily felt an icy chill run through her. The attic door, a wooden hatch built into the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, was ajar. A thin stream of blackness seeped out, darker than the surrounding shadows. "James," Emily whispered. "The attic." James turned to look, his face pale. "It was locked earlier," he said, his voice barely audible. "We have to see what's up there," Emily said, though every fiber of her being screamed against it. "If we don't, we'll never understand what's happening." James hesitated, then nodded grimly. "Stay here with Mia," he said, retrieving a flashlight from his toolbox. "I'll check it out." "No," Emily said firmly. "We go together. Whatever's in this house, we face it as a family." James pulled the cord, and the attic ladder creaked down with agonizing slowness. Cold air rushed down from the opening, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Emily felt Mia's small hand tighten around hers. As the three climbed the creaking steps, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The attic was dim, the only light coming from James's flashlight, which cast long, unsettling shadows on the slanted walls. The space was cluttered with old furniture and boxes stacked haphazardly, all coated in a thick layer of dust. Spider webs hung in the corners, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere above. James swept the flashlight across the room. "It's just junk," he muttered, though his voice betrayed his fear. But then the beam of light fell on something unusual. A large trunk pushed against the far wall, its surface adorned with the same spiral symbol they had seen in the basement tunnel and in Mia's drawings. Emily's breath hitched. "What is that?" James approached the trunk cautiously. It was locked with a heavy clasp, but the wood was rotted and brittle. "I'm opening it," he said, glancing back at Emily. She nodded, clutching Mia protectively. Using the handle of the flashlight, James pried the lock loose. The trunk creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made them all gag. Inside there were old photographs, papers, and a large, leather-bound journal. James pulled out one of the photographs and held it up to the light. "Oh my God," he whispered. The photo showed a family standing in front of the Turner house. It was unmistakably the same house down to the cracked shutters and sagging porch. But what sent a chill down James's spine was the eerie resemblance between the family in the photo and the Bennetts themselves. The father, mother, and daughter looked like mirror images of James, Emily, and Mia, except their faces were blurred, smudged into obscurity. "What is this?" Emily whispered, feeling a wave of nausea. James grabbed the journal, flipping through its brittle pages. The handwriting was frantic, disjointed, and difficult to read. "It's a record of the Turners," he said. The father wrote about seeing things in the house, shadows, figures with no faces. Emily's pulse quickened. What happened to them? James turned to the final entry, his voice shaking as he read aloud. "They want her. They've always wanted her. The man with no face says she belongs to them. We tried to run, but the house won't let us. If anyone finds this, please burn it all. Don't let them take her too." Before Emily could respond, Mia broke free of her grasp and walked to the center of the attic, her head tilted back, her gaze locked on the rafters above. "He's here," she said in a hollow voice. The flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging the attic into darkness. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then came the sound of something heavy dragging across the attic floor, circling them in the darkness. James fumbled with the flashlight, but it wouldn't turn back on. Emily held Mia tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" James shouted, his voice cracking. A low, guttural growl answered him, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Mine." Suddenly, the shadows in the attic seemed to shift and coalesce, forming a towering figure in the corner of the room. Its body was amorphous, like smoke given form, and its face, or lack thereof, was a blank, featureless void. Two hollow eyes stared back at them, deep and endless. Emily screamed, pulling Mia close as the figure took a step forward, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. The air grew icy, and the oppressive weight of dread pressed down on them like a physical force. "Leave us alone!" James shouted, throwing the journal at the figure. The book hit the ground, and the creature paused, its hollow gaze flickering toward it. For a fleeting moment, the whispers stopped, and the attic fell silent. Then the creature let out a bone-chilling shriek, and the shadows around it surged forward like a tidal wave. James grabbed Emily and Mia, dragging them toward the attic ladder. "Go!" he shouted. They scrambled down the steps, the sound of the creature's shriek following them. The attic door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, cutting off the darkness, but the house still felt alive, its walls groaning and shifting. Emily clutched Mia as James locked the attic door, though they all knew it wouldn't hold for long. "We have to get out," Emily gasped, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here." Mia looked up at her mother, her voice cold and distant. "He won't let us leave." The Bennetts huddled in the living room. the dim light from a single lamp casting weak halos in the oppressive darkness. Every creak of the house, every shifting shadow sent their nerves into overdrive. The journal lay open on the coffee table, its yellowed pages filled with the frantic scrawls of a man driven mad by the same horrors they now faced. Mia sat on the couch, eerily calm. Her small hands gripped Bun Bun tightly, her eyes fixed on a corner of the room that seemed darker than the rest. Emily knelt in front of her daughter, brushing her fingers through Mia's tangled hair. "Mia, sweetheart," she said softly, though her voice trembled. "Do you see him now?" Mia nodded slowly, her gaze never wavering. "He's standing right there, watching." James tightened his grip on the fireplace poker he had retrieved as a makeshift weapon. He stared into the corner, seeing nothing but shadows. "There's nothing there, Mia. It's just your imagination." "It's not," Mia replied, her tone disturbingly steady. "He's waiting for you to leave. He doesn't like Mommy." Emily's blood ran cold. "Why doesn't he like me?" Mia tilted her head, considering the question. "Because you're in the way." Desperate for answers, Emily turned to the journal. Flipping through its pages, she sought anything that might help them escape. Amidst the paranoid ramblings and fragmented sentences, one entry caught her eye. "He feeds on fear. The more you see him, the stronger he becomes. Don't look at him. Don't listen to him. If he speaks, he will take you." Emily read the words aloud, her voice faltering as she reached the end. "We can't look at him. We can't listen to him." James's grip on the poker tightened. "That's easier said than done. We can't even see him." Mia interrupted him. "I see him." The weight of her words hung in the air. Emily pulled Mia close, her hands trembling. "Mia, listen to me. You have to look away. Don't look at him anymore, okay?" Mia's lip quivered. "I try, Mommy, but he's always there." The house groaned, its timbers bending as if under an enormous weight. Then from somewhere upstairs, a door slammed shut with a thunderous bang. James shot to his feet, the poker raised defensively. "That's coming from the attic," he said, his voice tight. Emily shook her head. "Don't. We can't go back up there." But James's jaw was set. "We need to end this. If he's up there, maybe we can—" "James, no!" Emily grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "We don't even know what we're dealing with." Before James could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Mia's voice broke the silence. "He's closer now." Emily turned to her daughter, dread pooling in her stomach. Mia was staring at the far corner of the room, her face pale. Slowly, Emily followed her gaze. The shadows in the corner seemed denser, darker, as if they were absorbing the light. And then she saw it, a faint outline, a figure standing impossibly still. James stepped forward, squinting into the corner. "I don't see." "Don't look," Emily cried, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "Don't look at him, James." The figure moved, its featureless face turning toward them. Though it had no eyes, Emily felt its gaze pierce through her. The air grew icy, and a low whisper began to fill the room, layering over itself in a discordant hum. James's hand tightened on the poker, but Emily grabbed his wrist. "No, don't do anything. Just don't look at him." The whisper grew louder, the words unintelligible but crawling under their skin. James clamped his hands over his ears, but Mia sat frozen, staring at the figure. Her lips moved silently, as though she were repeating its words. "Mia," Emily shook her. "Mia, don't listen." But it was too late. Mia's eyes rolled back, and her body went limp in Emily's arms. The whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The shadowy figure was gone. "Mia!" Emily cried, cradling her daughter. "Wake up, baby! Please wake up!" James knelt beside them, his face pale with panic. "What happened? Is she breathing?" Emily pressed her ear to Mia's chest, relief flooding her when she heard a faint heartbeat. "She's alive, but she won't wake up." James ran a hand through his hair, his voice breaking. "This is my fault. I never should have opened that damn door." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We need help, James. We can't fight this on our own." James stood abruptly. "We're leaving. Right now. I don't care if the house tries to stop us." He scooped Mia into his arms, her limp body barely stirring. Emily grabbed the journal and followed him to the front door. But as James reached for the doorknob, the entire house shuddered violently. The walls groaned and a deep guttural growl echoed from every direction. The shadows in the room stretched and writhed, coiling like living things. The doorknob wouldn't budge. "It's locked," James said through gritted teeth, yanking at the door with all his strength. "It won't let us out." The growl grew louder, and the shadows surged forward, enveloping the room. Emily clutched James's arm, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Mia's voice, faint and distant, drifted up from James's arms. "He's here." And then in the center of the room, the shadows solidified, taking shape. The man with no face loomed over them, his hollow eyes fixed on Mia. Emily screamed, "Stay away from her." The figure tilted its head, as though amused. And then it spoke, its voice a cacophony of whispers layered over one another. "She belongs to me." The man with no face loomed in the center of the room, his featureless visage casting an unnatural darkness over the Bennets. The air was thick, almost choking, and the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling cold. James held Mia tighter, her limp body feeling smaller and frailer in his arms. Emily stood frozen, clutching the journal, her mind racing for a way out. "Leave her alone," Emily screamed, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. The figure didn't respond. Its hollow eyes, if they could even be called that, seemed to fix on Mia. The whispers began again, layering over themselves until they became a deafening cacophony. "She belongs to me," the figure repeated, its voice vibrating through the walls. "No, she doesn't," James shouted, his grip on Mia tightening. "She's our daughter." The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and unnatural. "She has always been mine." The shadows in the room began to writhe, coiling toward the family like black tendrils. James backed away, but the shadows followed, inching closer with every step. Emily flipped through the journal, her shaking hands barely able to turn the brittle pages. The frantic scrawls and cryptic notes blurred together until one passage caught her eye. "The ritual is the key. To sever his hold, you must undo what was done. The spiral binds him, the spiral frees him." "The spiral," Emily whispered to herself. Her eyes darted to Mia's drawings, the chaotic spirals scrawled all over the walls. It was the same symbol on the attic trunk, the basement door, and even in the Turner family photos. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was the focal point of the entity's power. "James!" Emily cried, holding up the journal. "The spiral, it's how we stop him." James looked at her, desperation etched on his face. "What does that even mean?" Emily scanned the page again, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "We have to destroy the spiral. It says it binds him here. If we can break it." The figure interrupted her, its voice a thunderous roar. "You cannot undo what has been done." The shadows surged forward, snaking around James's legs. He stumbled, almost dropping Mia, but managed to hold her close. Emily grabbed a chair, swinging it wildly at the tendrils. The moment the wood struck them, the shadows recoiled with a shriek, retreating momentarily. "James, get to the basement," Emily yelled. "The spiral on the door, it's the source." The family bolted toward the basement, the shadows chasing them like living smoke. James stumbled down the stairs, gripping Mia tightly, while Emily followed, her breath ragged. As they reached the bottom, the temperature dropped even further, and the familiar metallic stench of the tunnel hit them like a wave. The basement door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in. James placed Mia gently on the ground, her small body eerily still. Emily shone her flashlight toward the tunnel entrance, the carved spiral on the wooden door gleaming faintly in the beam. "That's it," Emily said, her voice shaking. "We have to destroy that door." James grabbed a crowbar from a nearby shelf and advanced toward the spiral. The shadows gathered at the tunnel's entrance, forming a pulsating black wall. The whispers grew louder, the words unintelligible but full of malice. As James raised the crowbar, Mia stirred, her eyes fluttered open, and she whispered, "No, don't." Emily knelt beside her. "Mia, sweetheart, what's wrong?" "He'll get mad," Mia said weakly. "He doesn't want you to touch it." "That's exactly why we have to," Emily said, brushing her daughter's hair back. "Stay with me, honey. We're going to stop him." James swung the crowbar, smashing it against the wooden door. The spiral cracked but didn't break. The shadows let out an ear-piercing shriek, surging toward James like a tidal wave. He swung again, harder this time, and the spiral split down the middle. The reaction was immediate. The walls of the basement groaned, and the shadows recoiled violently, their form destabilizing. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, shaking the house. "He's weakening," Emily shouted. "Keep going." James struck the door one last time, shattering it completely. The spiral disintegrated into fragments, and the shadows screamed, a high-pitched wail that seemed to pierce their very souls. For a moment, everything went still. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the basement was bathed in an unnatural silence. "Is it over?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily glanced at Mia, who was sitting up, her eyes clear and alert. "Mommy," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "He's gone." Emily's relief was short-lived. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the basement. "You cannot break what is eternal," the voice said, no longer a whisper but a booming presence. The shattered door reassembled itself, the spiral reforming with a sickening twist. The shadows returned, more powerful than before, their tendrils snaking toward the family. "We have to burn it," Emily screamed. "It's the only way." James grabbed a can of kerosene from the storage shelf, dousing the door and the tunnel walls. Emily lit a match, her hands trembling, and threw it onto the soaked wood. The flames roared to life, consuming the door and spiraling outward. The shadows shrieked, writhing violently as the fire devoured the symbol. The house itself seemed to scream, the walls trembling and cracking as the fire spread. James grabbed Mia and pulled Emily toward the stairs. "Run!" he shouted. The family bolted up the basement stairs, the fire roaring behind them. The house groaned, its very foundation shaking as though it were alive. They burst through the front door just as the house collapsed inward, consumed by flames. Outside, under the cold night sky, the Bennetts watched as the Turner house burned. The oppressive presence was gone, the air lighter, freer. For the first time in days, Emily felt like she could breathe. Mia clung to her mother, her voice small. "He's really gone now, isn't he?" Emily held her tightly, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, sweetheart, he's gone." But as they stood there, watching the fire die down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the forest. And in the faint glow of the embers, a familiar spiral began to form in the ashes. The Turner house was reduced to smoldering ashes, but the Bennetts' ordeal was far from over. The spiral symbol etched itself into Emily's mind, its crude lines burning in her thoughts like an open wound. The family spent the night at a nearby motel, their nerves frayed, their sense of safety shattered. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes hollow. James was pacing by the window, staring out into the empty parking lot as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Mia lay curled up between them, asleep but restless, murmuring unintelligibly under her breath. "We destroyed the house," James said, his voice taut with frustration. "We burned it to the ground. Why doesn't it feel like it's over?" Emily clutched the journal tightly, her knuckles white. She had refused to leave it behind, convinced it held the answers they needed. "Because it's not over," she said softly. "The spiral wasn't just on the house, it's part of something bigger." James stopped pacing and turned to face her. "What are you saying, that this thing can follow us?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I don't think we were fighting the house, James. I think we were fighting whatever created it, and it's still out there." That night, Emily barely slept. She pored over the journal by the dim light of a bedside lamp, scanning every word for clues. Amid the frantic scrawls, she found a passage she hadn't noticed before. "The spiral marks the threshold. It is the seal that binds him, but it is also his doorway. Destroying it does not close the door, it only moves it. To banish him, we must sever his connection to the living world." "What does that mean?" Emily whispered to herself, her fingers trembling as she traced the faded ink. "How do we sever it?" She flipped the page, but the journal ended abruptly. The rest of the pages were torn out, leaving only jagged edges and an unsettling silence. The next morning, the Bennetts decided to leave Hollow Point. James packed their bags while Emily helped Mia into the car. They had no clear destination, only the overwhelming need to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the ruined house. As they drove out of town, the dense forest pressed in on either side of the road, its gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Mia sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes. "We'll find a new place," James said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Start fresh, somewhere far away from all of this." Emily nodded, though she couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. The journal's words echoed in her mind. Destroying it does not close the door, it only moves it. Hours passed as they drove deeper into the countryside, the forest giving way to open fields and rolling hills. The tension in the car began to ease, and for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to believe they might be safe. But then Mia spoke, her voice startling in the silence. "We can't run from him." Emily turned in her seat, her heart sinking. "What did you say, sweetie?" Mia's gaze was fixed on something in the distance, her small hand clutching Bun Bun tightly. "He's not in the house anymore," she said. "He's here." James slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the empty road. He turned to face Mia, his voice trembling. "What do you mean, Mia? How is he here?" Mia looked at them, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "He followed us." Emily's chest tightened. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "We destroyed the spiral. We destroyed him." Mia's lip quivered. "You didn't destroy him, Mommy. You let him out." Before they could respond, the car's radio crackled to life, emitting a low, guttural static. The sound grew louder, building into a cacophony of overlapping whispers. The car's engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered before plunging them into darkness. James tried the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a deep, resonant growl. Emily looked out the window, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows outside the car seemed to move, coalescing into a tall, featureless figure. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, cutting through the darkness. "He's here," Mia said softly. The man with no face stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the car. The whispers in the radio rose to a deafening crescendo, and the air inside the vehicle grew cold and heavy. Emily turned to James, her voice frantic. "The journal, it said we have to sever his connection to the living world. There has to be a way." James fumbled for the journal, flipping through its pages. "There's nothing here. Nothing tells us how to do that." Mia's voice, calm and steady, broke through the chaos. "You have to go back." Emily and James stared at her in confusion. "Back where?" Emily asked. "To the door," Mia said. "The one in the basement." Emily's heart sank. "But the house is gone. There's no basement left." Mia shook her head slowly. "The door isn't gone. It's waiting for you." The shadows outside began to close in, tendrils of darkness slithering toward the car. The figure raised a hand, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Then, in a voice that reverberated through their very bones, the figure spoke. "Return, or she is mine." Mia whimpered, clutching Bun Bun tighter. James and Emily exchanged a panicked look, their faces pale. "What do we do?" James whispered. Emily took a deep breath, her decision made. "We go back, we end this." James hesitated, then nodded grimly. "Okay, but this time, we don't leave until it's over." Emily turned to Mia, her voice trembling but firm. "We're going to protect you, sweetheart, I promise." Mia nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He won't stop until you do." With a final, shuddering breath, James restarted the car. The engine roared to life, and the shadows receded slightly. The man with no face stood unmoving as they turned the car around, heading back toward the smoldering ruins of the Turner house and the basement door that still waited beneath. The drive back to the ruins of the Turner house was suffocating. The Bennetts said little, the tension between them palpable. Mia sat in the back seat, uncharacteristically quiet, her hands clutching Bun Bun like a lifeline. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, while James gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The forest loomed darker than before, as if the trees themselves had grown closer, their gnarled branches reaching for the car. The air seemed heavier, colder, and the oppressive silence pressed against their ears. Even the car's engine sounded muffled, as though they were driving underwater. "Are we doing the right thing?" James finally asked, his voice barely audible. "We don't have a choice," Emily replied, clutching the journal in her lap. "If we don't go back, he'll never stop. He'll take her." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew Emily was right. When they reached the Turner house, the sight that greeted them was both familiar and alien. The ruins were still smoldering, tendrils of smoke curling into the cold night air. The house was gone, but the foundation remained, a gaping, blackened pit in the earth. Emily stepped out of the car, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming sense of dread that permeated the air. Mia climbed out behind her, her small face pale and drawn. James followed, gripping the crowbar he had brought as a weapon. The three of them approached the edge of the foundation, peering into the darkened basement below. The spiral door was gone, but in its place was an open void, a jagged hole in the earth that seemed to swallow the light. The faint sound of whispers drifted up from the depths. "It's still here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "How do we even get down there?" James asked, his tone sharp with frustration. "There's no ladder, no stairs." "We jump," Emily interrupted, her gaze fixed on the void. "It's the only way." James stared at her, his expression incredulous. "You can't be serious." "I am," Emily said firmly. "This is what he wants. This is where we have to go." Before James could protest, Mia stepped forward, her voice small but steady. "I'll go." "No," Emily and James shouted in unison, pulling her back. "You're not going anywhere," Emily said, kneeling in front of her daughter. "We're going to fix this. You stay here, Mia. Stay safe." Mia's eyes filled with tears. "But he wants me. If you go, he'll just get angrier." Emily cupped Mia's face, her heart breaking. "We'll protect you, I promise." With a deep breath, Emily turned to James. "Let's go." James hesitated, then nodded, his grip tightening on the crowbar. Together, they approached the edge of the pit. The whispers grew louder, forming disjointed words and phrases that clawed at their sanity. "Turn back. She is mine. You cannot win." Ignoring the voices, Emily and James jumped into the void. The fall was longer than it should have been, the air rushing past them in a deafening roar. When they finally landed, the ground beneath them was damp and soft, like soil after a heavy rain. The darkness was absolute, but the whispers were deafening, surrounding them from every direction. James fumbled for the flashlight he had brought, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow tunnel lined with jagged roots and claw marks etched into the dirt walls. The air was thick with the smell of decay. "Which way?" James asked, his voice barely audible over the whispers. Emily pointed down the tunnel, where the faint outline of the spiral symbol glowed faintly on the wall. "That way." As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the whispers grew louder, forming a rhythmic chant. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakably malevolent. The tunnel began to widen, opening into a cavernous chamber. In the center of the chamber stood the man with no face. He was taller than before, his shadowy form stretching upward until his head nearly touched the ceiling. The hollow eyes glowed faintly, and the spiral symbol pulsated on his chest, like a living, breathing wound. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "You should not have come back." Emily stepped forward, holding the journal like a shield. "We're here to end this." The figure tilted its head, an almost mocking gesture. "You cannot end what has no beginning. I am eternal." James raised the crowbar, his hands trembling. "We'll see about that." The figure raised an arm, and the shadows in the chamber surged forward, tendrils reaching for them. Emily flipped open the journal, searching for the final passage. "James!" she shouted. "Keep him back!" James swung the crowbar, striking at the shadows. The metal connected with a sickening squelch, and the tendrils recoiled, but they kept coming. Emily read the journal aloud, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. You are bound by the spiral. You are tied to this place. We sever the link. We banish you. The figure let out an ear-splitting shriek, its form flickering like a dying flame. The spiral on its chest pulsated violently, cracking and splintering. Keep going, James yelled, swinging the crowbar wildly as the shadows surged again. Emily continued, her voice rising above the chaos. You have no claim here. Your doorway is closed. The cavern shook violently, and the spiral on the figure's chest shattered like glass. The man with no face let out one final, piercing scream before disintegrating into a cloud of black smoke. The whispers stopped, the shadows receded, the cavern fell silent. Emily and James stood motionless, their breath ragged. The chamber around them began to collapse, the walls crumbling inward. Run! James shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. They sprinted back through the tunnel, the ground shaking beneath their feet. As they reached the pit where they had fallen, a beam of light shone down, Mia's flashlight, her small face peering over the edge. Mommy, Daddy! James boosted Emily up, and she scrambled out, pulling him after her just as the pit collapsed. The ground caved in, swallowing the tunnel and the chamber below. The three of them lay on the ground, gasping for air. Mia crawled into Emily's arms, sobbing. It's over, Emily whispered, holding her daughter tightly. It's finally over. But as they sat there, the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. And on Mia's hand, unnoticed by any of them, was a small, faint spiral etched into her skin. The Bennetts spent the rest of the night huddled in their car, too shaken to return to the motel or drive far. The blackened pit where the Turner house once stood was silent, its collapse leaving no trace of the horrors they had faced. Dawn broke reluctantly, its pale light spreading across the sky like a reluctant promise of peace. Emily stroked Mia's hair as the little girl slept in her lap. James leaned against the car, staring at the ruins. The faint smoke that still rose from the earth twisted into shapes that made his stomach churn. It's over, Emily whispered, as much to herself as to him. It has to be. James didn't respond. He didn't have the heart to tell her he wasn't sure anymore. The family eventually made their way back to the motel, desperate for rest and clarity. James insisted on finding a new town, a new home somewhere far from Hollow Point. Emily agreed, though her unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly won. That afternoon, while James was packing their things, Emily noticed Mia sitting by the window, staring at her hand. The sight sent a chill down Emily's spine. Mia? Emily said, her voice carefully calm. What's wrong? Mia looked up, her eyes wide and tired. It's still there. Emily knelt beside her daughter and gently took her hand. That's when she saw it. A faint spiral etched into Mia's palm, almost like a scar. Emily's heart sank and her breath caught in her throat. What is this? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Did you draw this? Mia shook her head. No, he gave it to me. Emily's chest tightened. What do you mean, sweetheart? Who gave it to you? The man, Mia said softly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Before you broke the door, he said I was his, that I'd always be his. Emily's hands trembled as she held Mia's. No, honey, you're not his. We stopped him. He's gone. Mia looked at her mother, her expression grave. He's not gone, Mommy. He's hiding. Emily rushed to James, holding up Mia's hand. Look, she said, her voice trembling. It's the spiral. It's on her. James's face drained of color as he examined the faint mark. No, he whispered. We destroyed it. We destroyed him. Then why is this here? Emily cried. Why is she saying he's still with her? James ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Maybe it's just a scar from everything she's been through. It doesn't mean he's still here. But Emily shook her head. You don't believe that. Neither do I. That night, the dreams began. Emily woke gasping for air, her body drenched in sweat. Her dreams had been vivid, filled with spirals and shadows, whispers and hollow eyes. She turned to check on Mia, only to find the little girl standing by the motel window, staring out into the darkness. Mia! Emily whispered, her voice hoarse. "What are you doing?" "He's out there," Mia said without turning around. "He's waiting." Emily's blood ran cold. "Come back to bed, sweetheart. It's just a bad dream." Mia turned slowly, her face pale and her eyes dark, as though the light behind them had dimmed. "It's not a dream, Mommy. He's coming." The next morning, James suggested they leave immediately. "We'll drive until we can't anymore," he said, tossing bags into the trunk. "Put as much distance as we can between us and this place." Emily didn't argue. Mia sat silently in the back seat, her face pressed against the window. The spiral on her hand seemed darker now, more defined. Emily tried to ignore it, but the fear gnawed at her. As the Bennetts drove, the landscape seemed to shift unnaturally. The winding roads through the countryside blurred together, the trees looming larger and darker. Hours passed, but no matter how far they went, the world outside the car began to feel disturbingly familiar. "James," Emily said, her voice shaking, "do you recognize this road?" James glanced around, his brow furrowing. "It looks like, but it can't be." They turned a corner, and Emily's worst fear was realized. The smoldering ruins of the Turner house came into view, exactly as they had left it. "No," Emily whispered, clutching Mia. "This isn't possible. We left." James slammed his fists against the steering wheel. "This can't be happening. We've been driving for hours." Mia broke the silence, her voice eerily calm. "He won't let us leave." The car died as they sat staring at the ruins, the engine sputtering and falling silent. The oppressive silence of Hollow Point surrounded them, broken only by the faint sound of whispers in the distance. James grabbed the crowbar from the trunk, his face pale but determined. "We go back. We end this for good." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We've already tried. It didn't work." "We don't have a choice," James said. "He's toying with us. If we don't stop him, we'll never escape." Emily hesitated, then nodded. They took Mia's hand, and together they walked back to the ruins. In the center of the collapsed foundation, the spiral glowed faintly in the ashes. As they approached, the whispers grew louder, forming words they could barely understand. "You cannot leave, she is mine. You will always return." Emily held Mia tightly, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from us?" The ground trembled, and the man with no face rose from the ashes, his hollow eyes glowing with malice. "The doorway is mine," he said, his voice a thunderous roar. "She is mine." Emily stepped forward, the journal clutched in her hands. "You can't have her." The figure tilted its head. "The spiral binds us. You cannot break it. You cannot win." Emily looked down at the spiral on Mia's hand, her mind racing. The journal had spoken of severing his connection, but the doorway wasn't just in the house, it was in Mia. She was the link. "No," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We can break it." She grabbed Mia's hand and pressed her thumb over the spiral, blocking it. Mia screamed as the mark burned beneath her skin, but Emily didn't stop. "You don't own her," Emily shouted. "She's not yours." The man with no face let out a piercing shriek, his form flickering and dissolving like smoke. The spiral on Mia's hand began to fade, the mark burning away into ash. The figure's final words echoed in the air, chilling and faint. "This is not the end." The spiral vanished, the air grew still, and for the first time in days, the Bennetts felt the weight lift. They left Hollow Point that day, never looking back. But Emily knew, deep in her heart, that the man with no face wasn't truly gone. Somewhere, in the shadows of the world, the spiral waited, and it would call again.